The notification came at 11:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been checking my phone every few minutes for 2 hours, sitting in the back of a cab stuck in downtown traffic, watching the skyline of Chicago slide past the window like a postcard I had been trying to earn the right to keep. The text was from my mother. It said, "Honey, I'm so sorry. Jake really needs us there today. You understand, right? We'll celebrate with you when you get home for Christmas." That was the whole message. No explanation of what there meant, as if I didn't already know. No acknowledgement of what I was about to walk into. Just a request for my understanding delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never once worried I wouldn't give it. I was 40 minutes away from receiving the AIA Young Architect of the Year award at a ceremony at the Chicago Cultural Center. 4 years of competition, 17 projects submitted across the country, one winner selected by a panel of judges who had spent 3 days reviewing structural drawings, site photographs, and impact assessments. My project, a mixed-use affordable housing development in the Pilsen neighborhood that had been written up in Architectural Digest and cited in 2 urban planning journals, had won. My family was in Dayton, Ohio, standing in the parking lot of a hardware store my brother had just spent 8 months renovating. I put my phone in my bag. I did not reply. The cab moved forward 3 car lengths and stopped again. Let me back up, because the hardware store is not where this story actually starts. It starts the way most things in my family started, with my brother Jake needing something and the rest of us reorganizing ourselves around that need without anyone calling it what it was. Jake is 3 years older than me. He is loud and funny and genuinely charming in the way that some people are just wired for. The kind of person who makes a room feel more alive by entering it. My parents did not prefer him consciously. I want to be careful about that, because I spent too many years believing the worst interpretation before I understood what was actually happening. What was actually happening was simpler and sadder than malice. They just understood him better. His world, concrete, immediate, built with hands, was legible to them in a way mine never quite was. My father spent 30 years in commercial contracting. My mother ran the books for the family business. Jake had joined the business at 22. He spoke their language fluently. I had left for architecture school at 18 and come back speaking something they had no vocabulary for. An A in structural engineering my junior year. Does that mean you're good at it, or just that you passed? A summer internship at a firm in Boston? But will you have a real job when you graduate? A design award from my university that came with a $5,000 prize. That's wonderful, honey. Jake got his contractor's license today. We're taking him to dinner. None of these moments broke me individually. That is the thing about that particular kind of erosion. It doesn't break you. It just slowly convinces you that the standard for your achievements is set just slightly higher than whatever you last did, while someone else's standard stays fixed at good effort, good try. We're proud of you for trying. By the time I moved to Chicago at 26 to join a mid-sized firm specializing in affordable housing development, I had learned to carry my own excitement. I celebrated my own promotions. I framed my own press mentions and hung them in my apartment where only I could see them. I told myself this was independence. I told myself this was what grown women did. I did not examine too closely whether there was grief underneath the independence, because examining it felt like losing. The AIA nomination had come in February. I had called my mother that same evening, something I did less frequently than I once had, but still did, because hope is not a thing you can simply decide to stop doing. I told her what it meant, that this particular award, for someone my age, was the kind of thing that changed the trajectory of a career. She said that sounded wonderful. She asked if Jake had called me because he had just finalized the lease on a commercial space in Dayton and was planning a major renovation and reopening of the family hardware business. And did I have any thoughts on the layout because I was the expert? I gave her my thoughts on the layout. I did not call again about the nomination. I won the award on a Thursday in April. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon. I had sent the details to my parents in March, the address, the time, the name of the award, a link to the Cultural Center's website with a photograph of the grand hall where it would be held. My father responded that it looked beautiful. My mother said they would try their best to make it work with Jake's reopening timeline, which was scheduled for that same weekend. The reopening had been scheduled after the ceremony date was announced. I knew this because I had checked. I did not say anything about it because saying something would have required naming what was happening, and naming it would have meant accepting that it was real, and accepting that it was real felt at that moment like more than I could afford to do and still walk into that building and receive that award without my face doing something I would regret. The Cultural Center was built in 1897, and it has the kind of interior that makes you feel, when you stand inside it, that the building itself is paying attention to you. Tiffany glass dome ceilings, white marble floors. The ceremony was in the Preston Bradley Hall, and the light coming through the mosaic glass that afternoon was the color of something that should not exist in a city in April, but did, pressing gold and green through every window like the building had decided to make the point on its own. I stood in a receiving line with the other nominees. There were 6 of us. The man to my left was a 61-year-old architect from Portland who had been nominated 4 times before. He had the kind of steady presence that comes from having done the thing long enough to stop needing external permission to believe in it. He noticed that I kept glancing toward the entrance doors. "Are you looking for someone?" he asked. "No," I said. "Habit." He nodded and did not press it, and I was grateful for that. When they called my name, Elena Marsh, AIA Young Architect of the Year, he started clapping before anyone else in the room, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who simply felt it was the right response and did not consider whether it was his place to be that enthusiastic. By the time I reached the podium, the room was standing. I gave a short speech. I thanked my firm. I thanked my project team. I thanked the Pilsen community members who had given 2 years of their time to a design process that most developers would have bypassed. I did not thank my family. Not because I was making a statement. There was simply nothing to cite. The reception afterward was on the 2nd floor overlooking Washington Street. I stood with a glass of sparkling water and a small plate of things I wasn't tasting, and I thought, this is the part where a person is supposed to feel like something completed. And I thought, I wonder if it ever actually feels like that. Or if the feeling is always slightly ahead of you, like a horizon. My phone had 3 missed calls from my mother and a voicemail I did not listen to until I was back in my apartment that night, eating leftover Thai food in my dress, the award on the table next to my laptop. The voicemail was cheery. She said the reopening had gone beautifully. She said Jake had cried a little when they cut the ribbon, and wasn't that something? She said she was sure my ceremony had been wonderful and she couldn't wait to hear all about it. I put my phone face down on the table. I looked at the award. I thought about the 61-year-old architect who had started clapping before anyone else. I thought about the light through the Tiffany glass. I thought about 2 years of community design meetings in a neighborhood that the city had been systematically underserving for decades, and the way one elderly woman named Mrs. Aguilar had looked at the final rendering and said, "That looks like a place where people get to stay." I had been offered a position 6 months earlier that I had been sitting on. A small firm in Denver, Harper Structural Associates, doing high-impact public infrastructure work, bridges, transit hubs, the kind of projects that become part of a city's skeleton and stay there for a century. The founding partner, a woman named Dr. Claire Reyes, had been recruiting me since she read my Pilsen write-up. She had called twice. I had not called back, and the reason I had not called back was the same reason I had not yet fully unpacked the 3rd bedroom of my apartment that I had lived in for 4 years, which was the reason I had driven past my parents' neighborhood on my way to a project site in Columbus 6 months ago, just to see the house from the street without stopping, which was the reason I was standing in my kitchen at 10 at night, in an award ceremony dress, eating cold pad see-ew alone. I had been waiting for the situation with my family to quietly become something better. I had been treating geographic proximity to Dayton as a form of optimism. I emailed Dr. Reyes that night. I said I was ready to talk. I want to explain why I told my family about the move. This is the part people don't always understand, and I want to be clear about it rather than leaving it as a gap in the story, because the gap was there in how I thought about it for a long time before I figured out what I actually meant. I told them because I was not running away. Those are 2 different things. When you are running, you do not leave a forwarding address. When you are walking out a door you have decided to close properly behind you, you say, "I'm leaving. Here is where I'm going. Here is why." I did not owe them my new address. I gave it anyway, along with a brief and honest explanation, because I wanted to close the door like an adult and not disappear like someone who was afraid of them. I was not afraid of them. I was done with them in the specific way you are done with something when you finally understand that waiting for it to change is costing you more than the change would save. My mother's response came in 4 paragraphs. The first was about the Denver climate. The second was about how difficult the drive from Dayton would be now. The third was about Jake's business and how the first quarter after a reopening is always the hardest and family stability mattered so much during transitions. The fourth was a single sentence. "I hope this isn't about the ceremony because we watched the live stream and it looked like a really special day." My father's response was 2 sentences. "You've always made things harder than they need to be. I hope you know what you're doing." I packed my car on a Saturday in June. I drove to Denver in 2 days. I stopped in Kansas City and ate good barbecue by myself and watched the Missouri River from a bridge and felt, for the first time in several years, like the amount of space around me matched the amount of space I actually needed. Harper Structural Associates operated out of a converted 1940s warehouse in the Reno neighborhood. Dr. Claire Reyes was 53 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had long since stopped performing expertise and simply exercised it. On my first day, she put a project binder on my desk and said, "We've been hired to assess structural integrity on a cluster of mixed-use developments in the Southwest Aurora corridor. The city is fast-tracking affordable housing certifications and we think at least 2 of these projects have been underreported on their sub-foundation inspections. That's your first 6 weeks." She paused. "Welcome. Do you want coffee?" I found the problem in 8 weeks. It was not dramatic. It is almost never dramatic. What it was a pattern, a specific inconsistency between third-party soil compaction reports filed with the city and the actual subsurface load calculations in the structural drawings. On its own, each discrepancy was within the range that inspectors might flag as minor and move past. Taken together across 3 buildings developed by the same general contractor over a 4-year period, they described something systematic rather than accidental. The kind of systematic that means someone knew, at some point in the process, that the numbers did not match what was in the ground and filed the paperwork anyway. The general contractor on all 3 projects was a company called Marsh & Sons Construction Group. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. My father had incorporated the construction subsidiary under the family name 11 years ago, branching the business from commercial contracting into residential and mixed-use development. Jake ran the day-to-day operations. My father handled the larger client relationships. I had known this the way you know the background details of a life you have moved parallel to rather than inside peripherally, without examining it closely, because examining it closely had never seemed necessary or kind. It seemed necessary now. My conflict of interest disclosure to Dr. Reyes took 19 minutes. She listened without interrupting, asked 4 clarifying questions, and said, "You're recused from the certification recommendation and any communication with the city on this specific cluster. Everything else, you continue. And Elena, thank you for telling me the same day you found it. That matters." I called my father that evening. It had been 5 months since we had spoken. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which I had not expected. I told him what we had found. I was specific, and I was factual, because being anything else would have made it possible for him to hear something other than what I was saying. I told him the load calculation discrepancies were consistent across 3 sites, that the pattern suggested the sub-foundation reporting had been misrepresented to the city, that our firm was legally required to report our findings, and that the responsible path for him was to commission an independent structural audit and self-report to the Denver Department of Community Planning and Development before our report reached them. I told him he had approximately 60 days. There was a silence. Then, "Who put you up to this?" "Nobody put me up to this. This is my job." "You've had it out for Jake since before you even left. You know that, right?" "I have had nothing out for Jake. There are 3 buildings with people living in them, and the ground under the foundations does not match what is on the city's paperwork. Elena. His voice shifted into something I had heard before. The particular register that meant he had decided the conversation had a different subject than the one I thought it had. You moved away. You took that fancy award and you moved away, and now you want to come back into our business from 1,000 miles away and blow everything up? That's what this is? I didn't come into your business. Your business came into my assessment report. My mother got on the line. I heard the handset transfer, the familiar fumbling that meant they were in the same room and she had been listening. She said my name in the soft voice she used when she was about to explain something to me that she assumed I had not considered. She said that Jake had employees now, that these 3 projects represented 2 years of revenue, that whatever I thought I had found could probably be reviewed quietly between professionals without making it into something official. I thought about Mrs. Aguilar saying that looks like a place where people get to stay. I thought about what happens to a place where people are trying to stay when the foundation under it has not been built to hold them. I want you to fix this before the report reaches them, I said. That is still possible right now. It will not be possible in 60 days. My father came back on the line. And if we don't, then we file what we found. That's how this works. After everything, he said. And the everything in that sentence carried 31 years of his interpretation of events. His version, in which I had been difficult and ungrateful and prone to making things larger than they were. I had heard that version many times. I had spent a long time wondering if it was correct. I skipped my doctorate for a dinner reservation, I said. That is not everything. That is one example of a pattern. And I'm trying to prevent people from being harmed by something fixable. Those are not the same story, and I am not going to let you turn them into one. He did not respond to that. After a moment, he hung up. I contacted a civil engineering attorney the following week who specialized in professional liability and whistleblower protections. I documented everything, my disclosure to Dr. Reyes, the timeline of my recusal, every communication with my family before and after the findings. The documentation took 2 days, and I did it with the methodical calm of someone who has already made a decision and is simply building the paper trail that decision requires. The report went to the city 63 days after my disclosure. What followed moved the way institutional processes move. Not quickly, but with a kind of deliberate gravity that does not stop once it begins. The city ordered independent structural audits on all 3 sites. 2 of the 3 required remediation. Marsh & Sons received a formal notice of violation, a corrective action plan, and a civil penalty structured around the misrepresented filings. The buildings were not condemned. The underlying structures were sound enough that remediation rather than demolition was possible, which was the best realistic outcome, and also the one I had been hoping for when I thought about the people living there. The company's city contractor certification was suspended for 18 months pending a compliance review. Jake lost 2 major municipal contracts that had been in the pipeline. I want to be precise about what I felt, because the easier version of this story is that I felt vindicated, and the easier version is not true. What I felt was a specific kind of exhausted relief, the kind that is not about winning. It is about the particular tiredness of having held a difficult position correctly for a long time, and the moment when you are allowed to set down the effort of holding it. I had done my job. I had given my family 60 days and a clear path. I had told the truth when it mattered and documented everything that needed to be documented. The outcome was not something I had designed. It was something I had simply refused to prevent. My mother sent a letter 6 weeks after the penalty was issued. Real paper, her handwriting. She wrote that the business had taken a serious hit. She wrote that Jake was working with attorneys and it was very stressful for everyone. She wrote that my father was not doing well with it emotionally, and she hoped I understood the weight of what the family was carrying. Near the bottom of the letter, in slightly smaller writing than the rest, she wrote, "I've been thinking about the ceremony in Chicago. I don't know if we ever understood what it meant for us to be there. I don't know if we tried hard enough to understand it." I read that paragraph 6 times. I noticed what it was, and I noticed what it was not. It was an acknowledgement, which was more than I had received in 31 years on this particular subject. It was not an apology. It was the first honest sentence my mother had written to me in a very long time, and it had arrived only after consequence had made honesty affordable. I held that truth plainly, without bitterness, because bitterness requires believing that things should have gone differently, and I had moved past requiring things to have been different. They had been what they were. I was here. I wrote back. I said I was sorry for the hardship the business was facing. I said I had tried to give them the time to address it themselves. I said I was open to honest conversations when the honesty was not conditional on the outcome. I signed it with my full name, Elena Reyes-Marsh, because I had legally added my maternal grandmother's surname the month I moved to Denver, quietly and without announcement, because my grandmother had been the one person in my family who had ever looked at my drawings without asking who they were for. She had died when I was 22, and left me a small collection of architecture books and a card that said, "You see the world the way it could be. That's the rarest thing there is. Don't let anyone charge you for it." Elena Marsh had started to feel like a name I had been given. Elena Reyes-Marsh felt like a name I had arrived at. I mentioned the name change to my mother in the letter, not as a provocation. As information about who I was now. I explained that it was not about erasing the family. It was about adding something true to it. She responded briefly that she thought it was unusual, but she supposed I had my reasons. That was as much as she could offer. I accepted it as the full measure of what she had. My father has not responded to any communication since the phone call. I do not know if that silence is anger or grief or simply the particular stubbornness of someone who has never learned to be wrong out loud. I have stopped trying to interpret it. Some silences are information. This one told me what I needed to know. Jake sent a text message 4 months after the penalty. It said, "The city re-inspected last week. We passed. I hope you're doing all right out there." I sat with that for longer than I expected to. Jake was not apologizing, he was not acknowledging anything. But he was also not pretending I didn't exist, which was, given everything, more than I had expected from him. I replied that I was glad the inspections had gone well. I meant it. The buildings were safer now. The people in them were safer now. Whatever that had cost the business, and I knew it had cost significantly, it had been the right price for what it bought. Dr. Claire Reyes handed me a new project intake file on the same day I received Jake's text. A pedestrian bridge commission in the Glowville neighborhood, a community that had been cut off from the rest of the city by industrial infrastructure for 40 years. The preliminary designs from the city were fine, functional, code-compliant, forgettable. Claire wanted something that understood what a bridge means to a neighborhood that has been separated from everything on the other side of it. She handed me the file and said, "Make it look like it was always supposed to be there." I took the file home. I sat at my kitchen table with graph paper and a good pencil and a cup of coffee that was still hot, which is a thing I had stopped noticing when it happened and had recently started noticing again. Outside the window, the Front Range was doing something complicated with the afternoon light. I thought about the 61-year-old architect who had started clapping before anyone else. I thought about Mrs. Aguilar's face at the rendering presentation. I thought about a bridge. Not the one I was designing yet, but the idea of a bridge, the specific kind of structure that exists only to connect something to something else, that has no purpose except the passage it makes possible. I drew the first line. Then the second. The house I rent in Denver has a back porch that faces east and catches the morning light in a way that is, depending on the season, either very beautiful or so direct it is almost rude. I drink coffee there most mornings before I go in. Some mornings I call my mother. The calls are brief and careful, the way early-stage structures are careful before the load-bearing elements are established. She tells me about the business, about the neighborhood, about things she saw on television. I tell her about the projects I am working on. She does not always understand them, but she asks questions now in a way she did not used to. Small questions. Questions that suggest she is trying. It is not the relationship I spent 31 years waiting for. It is not a resolution with a ribbon on it. It is two people, connected by biology and complicated history, choosing occasionally to be honest with each other across a distance that is not only geographic. That is what I have. I have decided it is enough to work with. There is a question I keep coming back to, and I want to leave it with you the way it was left with me, because it is the kind of question that does not get smaller the more you look at it. If the people who are supposed to show up for you have spent years confusing your self-sufficiency with permission to not show up, if they have taken your ability to carry your own weight as evidence that your weight doesn't need to be carried by anyone else, at what point does continuing to make yourself smaller so they can stay comfortable become the most expensive thing you have ever paid for? I ask because I know what the answer cost me. I know what it looks like from the other side. The morning light on the porch. The coffee, still hot. The drawing board with the first lines of a bridge that is going to connect a neighborhood back to the city it was always supposed to be part of. I ask because I think you might already know the answer. I think the question is just waiting for you to say it out loud.